The courtroom was silent, so silent that even the sound of breathing seemed too loud. Everyone's eyes were on the frail-looking elderly black woman standing before the judge's bench. She was dressed in a simple gray skirt suit, her white curls neatly styled, her hands folded in front of her. She had a calm, knowing smile, the kind that made people wonder if she knew something they didn't. Judge Wilson, a tall, burly man with graying hair and a permanent scowl, looked down at her with a mixture of impatience and amusement. He leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he flipped through the file in front of him. "And who are you supposed to be, ma'am?" he asked with a smirk, his voice dripping with condescension. "The defendant's grandmother?" A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The elderly woman remained still, her expression unchanging. Judge Wilson's lips curled into a sneer. "Or are you just lost, sweetheart? This isn't a nursing home. This is a court of law." Laughter erupted from the gallery. Some of the younger attorneys whispered to one another, shaking their heads. The judge wasn't even trying to be subtle. The woman didn't flinch. "I know exactly where I am, Your Honor," she said softly. Her voice was steady, controlled, completely unaffected by the judge's mocking tone. But something in the way she spoke made the laughter die down almost instantly. Judge Wilson scoffed. "Then why are you wasting my time? We have a serious case to get through today." The elderly woman tilted her head slightly, her sharp eyes locking onto his. "Oh, I'm not wasting your time, Judge Wilson," she said, her voice carrying a quiet power that sent a shiver through the room. "In fact, I believe I'm about to change your entire understanding of this trial." The judge frowned, his smirk disappearing. "Excuse me." But before he could say anything else, a gasp came from one of the junior attorneys in the back. The young man's eyes widened as he quickly flipped through his own notes, realization dawning on his face. "No way," he muttered under his breath. The elderly woman turned ever so slightly, meeting his gaze. And in that moment, something shifted in the air. Everyone in the courtroom was about to realize that the person they had just mocked was no ordinary old woman. And when the truth came out, Judge Wilson would be the one left speechless. A week earlier, the small town of Crestwood had been buzzing with news about the upcoming trial. It wasn't every day that a case like this came through the courtroom, one that had the whole community talking. A young man named Daniel Hayes was being accused of a crime he swore he didn't commit. A break-in at a wealthy businessman's home had led to missing valuables, and Daniel, a 22-year-old college student, had been found near the scene. The evidence against him was weak, but the prosecution was relentless. Daniel's mother, Linda, was desperate. She knew her son was innocent, but no lawyer in town was willing to take his case. Everyone was afraid to go up against the powerful and influential victim, Robert Calloway, a man who had friends in all the right places. Linda had spent sleepless nights making calls, searching for anyone who would help. But all she got were rejections. "Ma'am, I'd love to help, but this case is a losing battle. I'm sorry, but Mr. Calloway has too much influence. No lawyer around here wants to risk their career. Your best bet is a public defender, but even then, it won't be easy." Linda was running out of hope. Then, one evening, just as she was about to give up, she got a call. A soft but firm voice spoke on the other end. "I'll take the case." Linda's heart pounded. Wait, who is this?" "You don't need to worry about that right now," the voice said gently. "Just know that your son will get the defense he deserves." Linda was confused, but something about the woman's voice made her trust her. Thank you so much," Linda whispered, tears streaming down her face. She was about to ask for a name when the call ended. The next morning, she met her son's attorney for the first time. To her surprise, the person standing in front of her was not a young, ambitious lawyer or a sharp-suited legal expert. It was an elderly black woman, dressed in a simple skirt suit, with silver-white hair and eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of wisdom. Linda blinked. You're the one who called." The woman smiled. "Yes, dear." Linda hesitated. "I don't mean to be rude, but are you sure you can handle a case like this?" The woman chuckled. "Oh, I can handle it, all right." Linda didn't know why, but she felt a strange sense of peace. Something about this woman told her that, despite how impossible things seemed, her son had a fighting chance. But neither of them had any idea just how much of a fight was waiting for them in that courtroom. And neither did Judge Wilson. Back in the courtroom, the tension was thick. Judge Wilson narrowed his eyes at the elderly woman standing before him. I don't have time for games, he snapped. If you're here to represent the defendant, you better prove you're even qualified. The woman gave him a small, knowing smile. Oh, I will, Your Honor, she said. And when I do, I think you'll find that you owe me an apology. The judge snorted. For what? Doing my job. She raised an eyebrow. No, for underestimating me. The courtroom fell into silence again. Judge Wilson let out a short laugh, shaking his head. This is ridiculous. Bailiff, get security in here. I'm not about to let some random old woman. Before he could finish, the young attorney in the back suddenly shot up from his seat. His face had gone pale, his hands trembling as he pointed at the elderly woman. Wait a second. His voice wavered. I know who she is. The room turned to him, confused. The judge frowned. Who is she then? The young attorney swallowed hard, his eyes wide with disbelief. But before he could finish, the doors to the courtroom suddenly burst open. A tall man in a dark suit stormed in, his face filled with urgency. And what he said next sent shockwaves through the entire room. Judge Wilson's smirk disappeared in an instant. The truth was about to come out. And when it did, nobody would ever look at this woman the same way again. The entire courtroom turned to the tall man who had just burst through the doors. His dark suit was perfectly pressed, his tie slightly loosened as if he had rushed here in a hurry. The moment his eyes landed on the elderly woman standing before the judge's bench, his expression shifted from urgency to complete shock. Judge Wilson furrowed his brow. And who are you? He demanded. But the man ignored him. Instead, he locked eyes with the elderly woman, his face pale as if he had just seen a ghost. This can't be, he muttered under his breath. The woman, however, remained calm, offering him the same knowing smile she had given everyone else in the room. She didn't say a word, simply waiting for the realization to sink in. The young attorney in the back, still trembling, finally spoke up. He swallowed hard, struggling to get the words out. She's not just some random old woman. Judge Wilson rolled his eyes, clearly losing patience. Then who is she? The courtroom held its breath. And then, just before the young attorney could reveal the truth. Enough of this nonsense. Judge Wilson snapped. His voice boomed through the courtroom, cutting through the tension like a knife. The elderly woman slowly turned back to him, her expression unreadable. Nonsense, she repeated softly. The judge scoffed. That's exactly what this is. A complete waste of my time. I have real lawyers here, actual legal professionals, and you. He gestured at her dismissively. Think you can just waltz in here and defend this case? You're a joke. A hushed murmur spread through the room. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others smirked, still assuming that this was just an old lady in over her head. But then, I may look old to you, Judge Wilson, the woman said, her voice steady. But I can assure you, I have more experience in this courtroom than you ever will. Gasps echoed around the room. The judge's face twisted in anger. Excuse me. The woman clasped her hands in front of her, still calm, still completely composed. I'm here to defend Daniel Hayes, she said simply. And that is exactly what I intend to do. Judge Wilson scoffed. That's rich. He turned to the bailiff. Get her out of my courtroom. Now. The bailiff hesitated. The elderly woman arched an eyebrow. You're making a mistake, Your Honor. The judge leaned forward, his smirk returning. No, you made a mistake by walking in here and thinking you could. But before he could finish, the tall man in the dark suit finally spoke. Wait. The command was sharp, firm, and for some reason, it made Judge Wilson freeze mid-sentence. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The tall man took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and finally turned to the judge. I need to speak with you privately, he said in a hushed but urgent tone. Judge Wilson frowned. Why? The man hesitated, then glanced at the elderly woman again before leaning in slightly. Because if you throw her out of this courtroom, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, you might be making the biggest mistake of your career. The judge's face twitched. He looked at the man, then back at the woman. And for the first time since this trial started, he seemed unsure. 1 week earlier, in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Crestwood, the elderly woman sat at her kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea. The air outside was crisp, the autumn leaves swirling in the wind, tapping lightly against her window. A knock at the door interrupted the peaceful silence. She placed her teacup down gently before standing, her movements slow but deliberate. When she opened the door, she found a desperate-looking woman standing on her porch. Linda Hayes. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands shaking as she clutched a folder close to her chest. "Please," Linda whispered. "I was told you might be able to help." The elderly woman studied her for a long moment before stepping aside. "Come in." Linda entered hesitantly, her breath hitching as she took in the cozy but simple surroundings. She swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. "My son, Daniel, he's been accused of something he didn't do, and no one is willing to help him." The elderly woman nodded slowly, gesturing for Linda to sit. Linda hesitated, gripping the folder tightly. "They said you were someone who used to be in law, that you don't take cases anymore. But I don't have anywhere else to turn." The woman leaned back in her chair. "They're right," she said softly. "I don't take cases anymore." Linda's heart sank. "But," the woman continued, her sharp eyes locking onto Linda's, "I do help when justice is being ignored." Linda's breath caught in her throat. "Does that mean?" The elderly woman smiled. "I'll take your son's case." Back in the courtroom, Judge Wilson was growing impatient. "I don't have time for these games," he snapped at the tall man. "If you have something to say it now." The man hesitated again, glancing around the room before sighing. Then, finally, he stepped forward. And when he said the elderly woman's name out loud for the first time, a collective gasp swept through the entire courtroom. Judge Wilson's eyes widened. His mouth opened slightly as if he wanted to speak, but no words came out. The attorneys in the gallery whispered among themselves, their expressions ranging from shock to complete disbelief. One of the senior prosecutors, a man who had been practicing law for over 30 years, looked absolutely stunned. The bailiff's jaw dropped. And in the back of the room, a young law student, who had only read about her in textbooks, clutched his chest as if he might faint. Because the truth was finally out. The woman standing before them. The woman Judge Wilson had mocked. The woman everyone had underestimated. Wasn't just an attorney. She was a legend. One of the greatest legal minds of the last 50 years. A name that once commanded respect in every courtroom across the country. The judge paled. He had made a huge mistake. And now, there was no turning back. Judge Wilson's face drained of color. His grip tightened on the gavel as the weight of the revelation settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. He stared at the elderly woman, his mind racing. This had to be a joke. This woman, the same one he had just mocked, the same one he had nearly thrown out of his courtroom, was her, the legendary attorney? His lips parted, but no words came out. A heavy silence filled the room as every single person turned to the elderly woman, their expressions ranging from awe to complete disbelief. The senior prosecutor, Robert Holloway, who had built a career on winning cases no matter the cost, leaned forward in his seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. This isn't possible," he muttered under his breath. The young attorney in the back, who had recognized her first, still looked as if he was struggling to breathe. His hands were shaking as he pushed his glasses up his nose, staring at the woman with something close to reverence. Judge Wilson cleared his throat, desperately trying to regain control of the courtroom. This is ridiculous," he scoffed, though his voice wasn't as strong as before. "There's no way you are who they say you are." Finally, the elderly woman spoke. "Are you so sure about that, Your Honor?" Her voice was soft, but it carried through the room like a thunderclap. Judge Wilson stiffened. He shook his head, shuffling through the papers on his desk, as if searching for something to disprove what was happening in front of him. "There's no way. I've been in law for decades, and I've never seen you in this courtroom before." A ghost of a smile touched the elderly woman's lips. "That's because I retired before you even became a judge." A gasp rippled through the room. Judge Wilson clenched his jaw. "That doesn't mean anything. Anyone can say they were a lawyer. If you expect me to believe." "I don't expect anything," she cut in smoothly. "I know who I am. The real question is, do you?" A murmur spread through the crowd. The young attorney in the back finally found his voice. "Her name," he said, his voice unsteady. "Her name is Eleanor Sutton." Judge Wilson froze. The name hit the courtroom like a bolt of lightning. Eleanor Sutton, a name that had once been spoken with admiration, fear, and deep respect in every major courtroom across the country. A name that law students studied in their textbooks. A name that had won cases no one else could win. that had fought for justice when it seemed impossible, a name that had changed the legal system. Judge Wilson's hands began to sweat. Eleanor Sutton was standing in front of him. The gallery erupted in whispers. No way, that can't be her. She retired years ago. Why would she come back now? I thought she was dead. Judge Wilson swallowed hard. If you really are Eleanor Sutton, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Then prove it. For the first time, the elderly woman's eyes sharpened. You want proof? She asked, tilting her head slightly. The judge straightened, trying to regain his authority. Yes. Eleanor let out a slow breath, then turned to the court reporter. Page 87, she said simply. The court reporter blinked. I'm sorry. In Harper v. State, page 87 of the final ruling, Eleanor continued. Read the second paragraph. The court reporter hesitated, then quickly began typing, pulling up the case on her screen. The moment she found it, her eyes widened. Oh my God! Judge Wilson frowned. Well, what does it say? The court reporter swallowed. In a landmark defense that reshaped how the court views prosecutorial misconduct, attorney Eleanor Sutton argued. She trailed off, her voice shaking. It's her. A heavy silence fell over the room once more. Judge Wilson's face burned with humiliation. He had mocked Eleanor Sutton, and now every single person in the courtroom knew it. 1 week earlier, in Eleanor's small home, Linda Hayes wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. Why would you do this for us? She asked, still unable to believe what was happening. Eleanor studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. Because I know what it's like to have no one fight for you. Linda frowned. But you're old. Eleanor finished with a small smile. That doesn't mean I forgot who I am. Linda hesitated. But if you're really her, if you're Eleanor Sutton, why did you retire? Eleanor's smile faded slightly. I retired, she said softly, because the system broke my heart. Linda stared at her, unsure of what to say. Eleanor let out a slow breath, looking out the window as the autumn leaves drifted through the sky. But, she continued, her voice stronger now, some battles are worth coming back for. She turned back to Linda, her sharp eyes filled with a fire that had never truly gone out. And your son's battle is one of them. Back in the courtroom, Judge Wilson gritted his teeth. This changes nothing, he snapped, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Does it not? The judge tightened his grip on the gavel. I don't care who you used to be. If you think I'm going to let you waltz in here and take over my courtroom. Your courtroom? Eleanor interrupted, her voice calm but firm. You seem to have forgotten something, Your Honor. The judge frowned. And what's that? Eleanor's lips curled slightly. This isn't your courtroom. A beat of silence. This courtroom, she continued, belongs to justice. And right now, justice is what stands between you and the biggest mistake of your career. Judge Wilson clenched his jaw. The entire courtroom was watching. He knew he was on the verge of completely losing control of this trial. He could either double down, or he could admit he had been wrong. His pride burned. And then, bam, the doors to the courtroom slammed open once again. A man in a police uniform stormed in, his face red with urgency. Judge Wilson turned sharply. What is the meaning of this? The officer didn't even look at him. Instead, he marched straight to the prosecution's table and handed them a folder. Robert Calloway, the businessman who had accused Daniel Hayes, stiffened as the folder was placed in front of him. The prosecutor opened it, and his face immediately went pale. His hands trembled. His breath quickened. And then, finally, he looked up at Judge Wilson. Your Honor, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Judge Wilson frowned. What now? The prosecutor swallowed hard. We need to talk. Eleanor Sutton smiled. The real trial was just beginning. A heavy silence filled the courtroom. Judge Wilson eyed the prosecutor, irritation flashing across his face. Talk about what? He demanded. The prosecutor hesitated, glancing down at the open folder in front of him. His face had gone pale, beads of sweat forming along his temple. His voice faltered. He swallowed hard before starting again. We may have a situation. The judge let out a frustrated sigh. Speak clearly, counselor. What situation? The prosecutor hesitated for a moment longer, then turned the folder around, sliding it across the desk for the judge to see. Judge Wilson leaned forward, his eyes scanning the contents. And then his face changed. His hand twitched as he gripped the edge of the folder tighter, his lips pressing into a thin line. He read the first page, then the second, then his breath hitched as he flipped to the third. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable, but his fingers drummed anxiously against the wood of his bench. Is this verified?" he asked, his voice lower than before. The officer who had rushed in nodded stiffly. "Yes, Your Honor. These are official records. We just received them this morning." Eleanor Sutton watched the exchange with a knowing gaze, but she said nothing. Judge Wilson closed the folder, exhaling sharply. He turned his attention back to the prosecution. "Does Mr. Calloway know about this?" At the mention of his name, Robert Calloway, the so-called victim, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His normally smug demeanor was gone, replaced by a nervous stiffness in his posture. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Not yet, Your Honor." Judge Wilson eyed him for a long moment before finally sighing. "We'll take a brief recess," he announced, his voice laced with tension. "Counsel, meet me in my chambers." He banged his gavel, signaling the break. The courtroom erupted into hushed whispers. People turned to one another, speculating wildly about what could be in that folder. What had shaken the prosecution so much that even Judge Wilson looked uneasy. And through it all, Eleanor Sutton stood still, patient, unmoved. She knew exactly what was happening, and she knew that this was just the beginning. 1 week earlier, Eleanor had sat in her small, dimly lit study, stacks of legal books and case files surrounding her like old friends. She flipped through the documents Linda Hayes had given her, absorbing every detail about Daniel's case. The arrest report, the so-called evidence, the flimsy witness statements. She saw it immediately. The cracks, the inconsistencies, the lies. Her sharp eyes lingered on one name in particular, Robert Calloway. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the desk. She knew that name. Oh, she knew that name very well. Slowly, a small, knowing smile formed on her lips. "This is going to be interesting," she murmured. Back in the courtroom, Daniel Hayes sat next to his mother, confusion written all over his face. "What just happened?" he whispered. Linda shook her head. "I don't know, baby. But whatever it is," she looked toward Eleanor, her heart pounding. "I think it's in our favor." Meanwhile, in the judge's chambers, the air was thick with tension. Judge Wilson stood behind his desk, arms crossed tightly as he addressed the prosecutor. "Explain." The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the new records we received, they show discrepancies in Mr. Calloway's claims." Judge Wilson's gaze darkened. "Discrepancies?" The prosecutor hesitated before nodding. "Yes, sir." He took a deep breath before continuing. "The timeline of events Mr. Calloway provided to the police does not match the surveillance footage from that night." Judge Wilson narrowed his eyes. "Surveillance footage?" The officer who had delivered the folder spoke up. "Yes, Your Honor. We just obtained additional footage from a nearby business." Judge Wilson clenched his jaw, and the officer hesitated. "And it shows that at the time of the reported burglary, Daniel Hayes wasn't even there." A heavy silence filled the room. The prosecutor rubbed his forehead. "If this footage holds up, Your Honor, we're looking at a potential false accusation." Judge Wilson exhaled sharply. He glanced toward the closed door of his office, as if imagining the courtroom full of people waiting for answers. He gritted his teeth. This case had been straightforward. Simple. At least, it should have been. But now? He was realizing that he might have been played. He turned to the prosecutor. "Does Calloway know we have this evidence?" The prosecutor shook his head. "No, sir." Judge Wilson's jaw tightened. He needed to handle this carefully. If it turned out that Calloway had knowingly provided false information, this case was about to explode. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, Eleanor Sutton sat calmly at the defense table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't surprised by this development. Not even a little. She had expected it. Because the truth was simple. She knew Robert Calloway was lying before she even stepped into this courtroom. She just needed everyone else to catch up. Linda turned to Eleanor, her voice trembling. "What do you think is happening back there?" Eleanor's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. "Oh," she murmured. "They're just realizing what I already knew." Linda frowned. "And what's that?" Eleanor glanced toward the judge's chambers, her sharp eyes gleaming. "That this case isn't about Daniel." Linda's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "This case is about Calloway." And just as she finished speaking, The doors to the judge's chambers swung open. Judge Wilson walked back to the bench, his expression unreadable. The prosecutor followed closely behind, looking rattled. And then, Robert Calloway stood up abruptly from his seat, his face suddenly very pale. Something was very wrong, and everyone in the room could feel it. Judge Wilson sat down, gripping the gavel tightly. "The court will reconvene," he announced, his voice firm but tense. Eleanor watched him carefully. She could tell. He was nervous. And if he was nervous, that meant the real battle was about to begin. Judge Wilson sat stiffly at his bench, gripping the gavel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The courtroom was silent, the tension thick as everyone waited for him to speak. Eleanor Sutton remained still, her sharp eyes fixed on the judge. She could see it in his expression, the uncertainty, the hesitation. He knew something was wrong. And now, he had to decide how to handle it. Judge Wilson cleared his throat. "Before we proceed any further," he began, his voice tight, "I need to address a matter that has just come to my attention." Robert Calloway shifted in his seat, his face pale. His normally confident demeanor was cracking at the edges. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, watching him like a predator studying its prey. She knew what was coming. Judge Wilson turned to the prosecutor. "Would you care to explain the new evidence you've just received?" The prosecutor exhaled sharply. He stood, adjusting his tie, clearly uncomfortable. "Your Honor," he said, "we have just obtained additional surveillance footage from a business near the alleged crime scene." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Wilson tapped his gavel once. "And what does this footage show?" The prosecutor swallowed hard. "It shows that at the time of the burglary," he hesitated, then turned to look at Daniel Hayes, who sat beside Eleanor. The defendant wasn't there. A collective gasp filled the room. Linda Hayes clutched her son's hand, her eyes welling with tears. Daniel's mouth fell open. "Wait, what?" Judge Wilson's face was unreadable. "Are you telling me that the key piece of evidence that led to this arrest is now in question?" The prosecutor nodded stiffly. "Yes, Your Honor." Another wave of whispers spread through the gallery. Judge Wilson turned his attention to Robert Calloway, his gaze sharp. "Mr. Calloway, you personally identified the defendant as the person who broke into your home." Calloway opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face had lost all color. Eleanor watched him closely. He was unraveling. Judge Wilson continued. "Is there anything you'd like to say about this new evidence?" Calloway licked his lips. I don't know anything about it." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Liar." Judge Wilson frowned. "You don't know anything about it? You swore under oath that it was Daniel Hayes you saw. Are you telling me you made a mistake?" Calloway's hands twitched. I. He glanced at the prosecutor, as if looking for help. But the prosecutor was staring at him with cold, detached eyes. The kind of look that said you're on your own. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. It was time to strike. She slowly stood from her seat, adjusting the cuffs of her gray suit. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm. "May I ask Mr. Calloway a question?" Judge Wilson hesitated. He should have denied her. He wanted to deny her. But for some reason, he nodded. "Proceed." Eleanor turned to Calloway. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "can you tell us how you first identified my client as the suspect?" Calloway let out a nervous chuckle. I saw him." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "You saw him?" "Yes." "With your own eyes?" "Yes." "In the dark?" Calloway hesitated. It wasn't that dark." Eleanor hummed. "Interesting." She paced slowly. "Because according to the police report, the area where the burglary took place had no streetlights, and the only light source was inside your home. Is that correct?" Calloway swallowed hard. I guess." Eleanor stopped walking. "So tell me, Mr. Calloway," she turned to face him fully. "How did you see Daniel Hayes so clearly if the area was pitch black?" Silence. Calloway's hands clenched into fists. I just knew it was him." Eleanor tilted her head. "You just knew?" "Yes." His voice was rising now, defensive. "He's a troublemaker. I've seen him in the neighborhood before. I knew it was him." Eleanor's expression didn't change. "So you assumed," she said simply. Calloway blinked. "What? You assumed it was him?" Eleanor repeated. Calloway hesitated. I didn't assume, Eleanor took a step forward. "Did you or did you not clearly see my client's face?" Calloway was breathing hard now. I thought I did." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "You thought you did?" More murmurs from the crowd. Calloway's panic was growing. Eleanor stepped closer. Mr. Calloway, she said softly, are you lying to this court? Calloway shot up from his seat. I know. I know what I saw. Eleanor didn't move. She just stared at him, unwavering, unshaken, waiting. Calloway's breathing was heavy. His fingers twitched at his sides. His eyes darted to the judge, the prosecutor, the jury. And then, bam! The courtroom doors flew open. A second officer rushed in, his face urgent. Your Honor, he said breathlessly, we have a problem. Judge Wilson's patience was running thin. What now? The officer hesitated, then turned to the prosecution. We've just received an anonymous tip. The prosecutor frowned. A tip about what? The officer took a deep breath. A tip about Calloway. The courtroom erupted into gasps. Calloway went completely still. Eleanor slowly turned to him, her gaze calm. She had been waiting for this moment. Judge Wilson pinched the bridge of his nose. What is the nature of this tip? The officer hesitated before stepping forward and handing a document to the prosecutor. The prosecutor's eyes scanned the page, and his entire expression changed. His face went pale. His hands tightened around the paper. Eleanor watched as the prosecutor's jaw clenched, his shoulders stiffening. And then, he slowly turned to face Calloway. His voice was cold. Mr. Calloway, he said, do you have anything you'd like to tell us? Calloway stiffened. I don't know what you mean. The prosecutor exhaled sharply, shaking his head. And then, he turned to Judge Wilson. Your Honor, he said, his voice filled with something dark and heavy. I believe we need to place Robert Calloway under immediate investigation. The courtroom exploded. People gasped, shouted. Some even stood in shock. Calloway's face drained of blood. Judge Wilson's grip on his gavel tightened. Eleanor Sutton remained still. She knew the tides had just shifted. The real trial had only just begun. The courtroom was in chaos. Gasps and murmurs filled the air, spreading like wildfire. The gallery was buzzing with excitement and disbelief, as if they had just witnessed the impossible. Robert Calloway, the alleged victim, was now the prime suspect. Judge Wilson banged his gavel 3 times. Order, he barked. There will be order in this courtroom. Slowly, the voices died down, but the tension remained thick, pressing against the walls like an invisible force. Calloway stood frozen, his hands gripping the edge of his table so hard his knuckles turned white. His once confident smirk had vanished, replaced by sheer panic. He turned toward the prosecutor. Why? You can't be serious, he stammered. Me? An investigation into me? This is ridiculous. The prosecutor's expression was cold, unreadable. He held up the document the officer had given him, waving it slightly. I am serious, Mr. Calloway, he said. And this new evidence suggests that you might not be as innocent as you claim. Eleanor Sutton watched the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. She had known from the start. She had felt it. Now, it was all falling into place. Linda Hayes, sitting next to Daniel, squeezed her son's hand. Oh my God, she whispered. Could this really be happening? Daniel was still in shock. He had spent weeks believing that his future was over, that no one would believe his innocence. And now, everything had flipped. Judge Wilson exhaled sharply. All right, he said. I need clarity. Officer, what exactly is in that report? The officer stepped forward. Your Honor, we received an anonymous tip this morning, and after looking into it, we discovered some interesting information. He paused, letting the suspense settle over the room before continuing. It turns out, he said slowly, that Mr. Calloway has a history of filing false reports. Another wave of gasps rippled through the courtroom. Eleanor remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable. But inside, she was ready. Judge Wilson narrowed his eyes. Explain. The officer nodded. 3 years ago, Mr. Calloway filed a similar burglary report. Same story. Someone broke into his home, valuables were missing, and yet, he turned toward the prosecutor. The case was dropped due to insufficient evidence. The prosecutor cleared his throat. That's correct, Your Honor. And upon further investigation, we found that no forced entry was ever recorded in that case either. Eleanor's lips twitched slightly. No forced entry. Just like now. Judge Wilson's gaze darkened as he turned to Calloway. Mr. Calloway, is there something you'd like to say about this? Calloway was spiraling. I don't remember that case, he said quickly. It was years ago. That has nothing to do with this situation. Eleanor spoke for the first time. Doesn't it? Her voice was soft, but it sliced through the tension like a blade. The entire courtroom turned to her. Calloway glared at her. You? Eleanor took a step forward, her sharp eyes locking onto his. Mr. Calloway, she said smoothly, it seems you have a habit of being unlucky. Calloway's jaw tightened. Twice, Eleanor continued. Twice, you've claimed to be the victim of a burglary. Twice, you've reported stolen valuables. And twice, her voice lowered, deliberate. There was no real evidence to support your claims. Calloway's breathing turned shallow. Eleanor tilted her head. Tell me, Mr. Calloway, she said, is this truly a coincidence? The room held its breath. Calloway knew he was cornered. He knew the walls were closing in. His eyes darted toward the judge, toward the prosecutor, even toward the bailiff, as if searching for an escape route. But there was nowhere to run. Judge Wilson tapped his fingers against his bench. Given this new information, he said carefully, I believe we have no choice but to. Bam! Before he could finish, Calloway slammed his hands on the table. This is insane, he shouted. You're all turning on me because of some old report. I'm the victim here. His voice cracked. His face was red with frustration, sweat forming on his brow. And in that moment, Eleanor knew something else. He was afraid. The courtroom was watching him, dissecting every movement, every shift in his voice. And he knew it. Judge Wilson let out a long, slow breath. Enough, he said. Given the multiple inconsistencies in Mr. Calloway's statements, and this newly discovered history of questionable reports, I have no choice but to. But Calloway cut him off again. You're all making a huge mistake, he growled, his voice trembling. Then, before anyone could stop him, he turned on Eleanor. You think you're so smart, don't you? He sneered. The room went dead silent. Eleanor didn't even blink. Calloway took a step forward, his fingers trembling as he pointed at her. You walk in here with your little act, pretending like you're better than everyone else, pretending like you're some wise old lady here to save the day? The tension in the room shifted. Linda gasped softly. Daniel stiffened. Even Judge Wilson's expression darkened. But Calloway didn't stop. I don't care who you used to be, he hissed. You're nothing now. The courtroom was dead still. Calloway's chest rose and fell rapidly. His breathing was unsteady. His anger was spilling out like a dam breaking. But Eleanor, she remained calm, unshaken, unmoved. Then, she smiled. And in that moment, Calloway knew. He had lost. Eleanor took a single step forward. Her voice was steady. You seem upset, Mr. Calloway. Calloway clenched his jaw. She tilted her head slightly. I wonder, why is that? Calloway's breath hitched. Eleanor's gaze was sharp as a blade. Is it because you know? She continued, her voice lowering. Because you feel it? Calloway's lip quivered. Eleanor took another step closer. Because right now, in this very moment, you realize something, don't you? Calloway swallowed hard. And then, Eleanor said the words that shattered him completely. You're not the one in control anymore. The courtroom gasped. Calloway's entire body went rigid. His fists shook at his sides. His breathing turned rapid. He had been exposed. Judge Wilson cleared his throat, regaining control. Given the current circumstances, he said, his voice more measured now, I have decided to pause these proceedings for further investigation. Calloway snapped. You can't do this, he roared. This is my case. He's the criminal, not me. But his voice was wild, unstable, desperate, and everyone in the room saw it. Judge Wilson sighed heavily, rubbing his temple. Mr. Calloway, I strongly suggest you remain silent. Calloway opened his mouth again. But before he could say another word, the bailiff stepped forward. Sir, he said, his voice firm. It's over. Calloway turned, his face twisted in rage. And then, the bailiff pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The courtroom exploded in shock. Robert Calloway was no longer the victim. He was about to become the suspect. Eleanor Sutton folded her hands neatly. She had won. The clinking sound of the handcuffs echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Robert Calloway's face went pale as the bailiff took a firm grip on his arm. This is a mistake, he snarled, his voice barely above a whisper, yet trembling with rage. You can't arrest me. Judge Wilson let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple as if he could feel a migraine forming. Mr. Calloway, at this time, you are not under arrest. Calloway's eyes flickered with hope. But you are officially under investigation for filing a false report and possible perjury. The judge finished, his voice firm. Calloway's mouth dropped open. You've got to be kidding me. The prosecutor, now standing with his arms crossed, didn't look amused. This investigation will determine if any legal action should be taken against you, Mr. Calloway, he said coolly. Considering the inconsistencies in your statements, I'd say you should start preparing your own defense. Murmurs erupted in the gallery. The courtroom had transformed from a prosecution against Daniel Hayes into something entirely different. Robert Calloway, the wealthy businessman, the alleged victim, was now the one on trial in the court of public opinion. And Eleanor Sutton had orchestrated all of it. Eleanor didn't smile. She didn't need to. The truth was enough. Daniel Hayes, still in shock, turned to his mother. "Mom," he whispered, "is this real?" Linda squeezed his hand, her eyes glassy with emotion. I think so, baby." Daniel shook his head. "This is crazy. 2 days ago, I thought I'd spend the rest of my life in prison." His voice cracked on the last word. Linda swallowed hard, pulling him into a hug. "Not today," she murmured. "Not if she has anything to say about it." And then, Calloway snapped. His rage bubbled over, and he lunged straight toward Eleanor Sutton. Gasps erupted from every corner of the room as his body moved faster than anyone expected. His fingers curled into fists. His teeth were clenched. And in that split second, the entire courtroom thought they were about to witness something terrible. But then, something shocking happened. Eleanor Sutton didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She didn't raise her hands in fear. She simply tilted her head. And when Calloway was just inches away from her, ready to explode, the bailiff tackled him to the ground. A collective gasp filled the room as Calloway let out a grunt of pain, his face hitting the cold marble floor with a thud. "That OLD woman ruined me," he roared, his voice muffled. "You don't know who I am." The bailiff twisted his arm behind his back, holding him down with ease. "You need to calm down, sir." Eleanor took a single step forward, towering over Calloway as he struggled against the officer's grip. She watched him, studied him, like a scientist examining a failed experiment. And then, in a voice so soft yet powerful, she spoke. "I do know who you are, Mr. Calloway." Calloway gritted his teeth. Eleanor's eyes bore into his. "You're a liar." The room went silent. Calloway's breath hitched. His struggles slowed. Judge Wilson slammed his gavel down. "That is enough. Bailiff, remove Mr. Calloway from my courtroom at once." "Yes, Your Honor." The bailiff hoisted Calloway to his feet, gripping him tightly as he dragged him toward the exit. Calloway twisted his head around, his eyes burning with fury as he glared at Eleanor. "You think this is over?" he seethed. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Eleanor finally let a small, amused smile touch her lips. "No," she said quietly. "You had no idea who you were messing with." Calloway let out a strangled growl as he was dragged out of the courtroom, the heavy wooden doors slamming shut behind him. The tension in the room slowly began to dissipate. Judge Wilson took a deep breath, shaking his head. "Well," he muttered, "that was unexpected." The prosecutor sighed. "That's an understatement." Judge Wilson turned his attention back to Eleanor. "And you?" he said, his voice now carrying something new, something close to respect. Eleanor looked up at him, waiting. Judge Wilson rubbed his chin before finally speaking. "I owe you an apology." A ripple of surprise went through the gallery. Even the prosecutor raised an eyebrow. Eleanor simply watched him, saying nothing. Judge Wilson sighed. "I misjudged you." His voice was quieter now. "I assumed you were nothing more than an old woman playing dress-up in my courtroom. I see now that I was very wrong." The entire courtroom was watching, waiting. And then, Eleanor nodded, ever so slightly. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said. Judge Wilson cleared his throat, quickly composing himself. "Now then, let's get back to the actual case at hand." He turned to the prosecutor. "Given the evidence, or lack thereof, against Daniel Hayes, do you still wish to pursue charges?" The prosecutor didn't hesitate. "No, Your Honor. We are officially dropping all charges." Gasps erupted once again, this time in joy. Linda covered her mouth with both hands, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Oh my God." Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, his chest rising and falling as he struggled to process what had just happened. Eleanor, however, remained composed. She simply turned to her client, offering him a small nod. "It's over." Judge Wilson tapped his gavel. "Then by the power vested in me, I declare the defendant not guilty." The courtroom exploded into cheers. Linda sobbed, pulling Daniel into the tightest hug she had ever given him. Daniel's eyes filled with tears as he whispered, "I'm free." The sound of celebration filled the air, the weight of injustice finally lifting from the room. And through it all, Eleanor Sutton stood still, quiet, watching. She had done what she came here to do. She had won. But she knew something the others didn't. This wasn't just about Daniel Hayes. This was about a broken system. And Eleanor Sutton wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The echoes of the gavel still lingered in the air, but the celebration had already begun. Daniel Hayes was a free man. His mother clutched him tightly, sobbing into his shoulder. The tension that had gripped them for weeks had finally lifted, replaced by a flood of relief and joy. The gallery buzzed with murmurs and applause. Even some of the courtroom staff, who had remained neutral throughout the trial, exchanged knowing glances. But Eleanor Sutton? She simply gathered her papers with quiet efficiency. She knew better than anyone. This wasn't truly the end. It was just the beginning. Judge Wilson let out a long breath, looking down at the courtroom with an expression that was hard to read. "This court is dismissed," he announced, tapping his gavel once more. People began rising from their seats, the chatter growing louder. Linda Hayes turned to Eleanor, her eyes still shimmering with tears. "I don't even know what to say," she whispered. "You saved my son's life." Eleanor gave a small, tired smile. "Justice saved him," she corrected gently. "I just reminded the court where to look." Daniel, his voice thick with emotion, extended a shaky hand toward her. "Thank you," he said, his words barely above a whisper. Eleanor looked at the young man, the same one who, just days ago, had been branded a criminal. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the disbelief that this nightmare was finally over. Instead of shaking his hand, she placed her palm against his and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "Go live your life, Daniel," she said softly, "and never let anyone tell you that you don't belong in this world." Daniel swallowed hard, nodding. Linda pulled Eleanor into a sudden, tight hug. "You're an angel," she whispered. Eleanor chuckled under her breath. "Hardly." As they embraced, a movement near the judge's bench caught her eye. The prosecutor, arms crossed, was watching her. His expression was unreadable. Then, without a word, he gave her a small, almost reluctant nod. "Respect." Eleanor returned the gesture before turning back to her things. She had done her job. She had won. But as she made her way toward the courtroom doors, she felt it. That nagging feeling in her gut. Something wasn't right. And as much as she wanted to believe this battle was over, she knew better. 2 hours later, Eleanor sat in a quiet cafe, stirring her tea. The celebration was over. The courtroom had emptied. The weight of the trial had finally lifted. But something still bothered her. Robert Calloway. She tapped her spoon against the ceramic cup, lost in thought. Something about him didn't sit right. It wasn't just that he had lied. It wasn't just that he had tried to frame Daniel. It was something else. A pattern. A history. Her gut told her that this wasn't random. Calloway had done this before. And if he had gotten away with it once, how many others had suffered because of him? The thought made her fingers tighten around her cup. She had spent years watching men like Calloway manipulate the system. They were powerful. They were privileged. And they were protected by the very institutions that were supposed to hold them accountable. Most of them slipped through the cracks. And Calloway? He had almost done the same. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Maybe she should have been satisfied with today's victory. Maybe she should have gone home, sat on her porch, and let the world move on without her. But she couldn't, because something told her. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Across town, in a dimly lit office, Robert Calloway sat hunched over his desk. His face was still flushed from the trial, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He had lost. And worse, he had been humiliated. Everything he had built, his reputation, his power, his control, all of it had been shattered by that old woman. Eleanor Sutton. His fingers drummed against the desk. He should have known she was dangerous. But now it was personal. He reached for his phone, his hands still shaking with fury. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice answered. "Do it," Calloway muttered, his voice dark. "Find out everything you can about her." A pause. Then, "Understood." The call ended. Calloway exhaled, forcing himself to calm down. This wasn't over. Not until he said it was. Back in the cafe, Eleanor took a slow sip of her tea, staring out the window. The streets outside were quiet, the world moving on. But she could feel it. Something was coming. A storm. She had spent years avoiding the courtroom, believing that her fight was over. But now she knew the truth. Her fight was only just beginning. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Eleanor Sutton sat on the porch of her small home, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. The warm glow of the street lamp outside cast long shadows across the pavement, stretching toward the trees that swayed gently in the breeze. She should have felt at peace. Daniel Hayes was free. Justice had prevailed. The courtroom had witnessed a victory no one saw coming. But Eleanor had been in this game long enough to know, when powerful men like Robert Calloway lost, they didn't just walk away. They struck back. She exhaled slowly, watching the steam rise from her cup. She had faced men like him before. Entitled, corrupt, vindictive. Calloway wasn't just angry that he lost. He was humiliated. And humiliation? That was the one thing men like him never forgave. Eleanor's sharp eyes flicked toward the dark street ahead. She wasn't afraid. But she was ready. Across town, inside a dimly lit parking garage, Robert Calloway paced angrily between two black SUVs, his phone pressed tightly against his ear. "This isn't over," he seethed. "I don't lose." A deep voice crackled through the speaker. "Then what do you want us to do?" Calloway's grip on the phone tightened. "Find out everything you can about that woman," he spat. "Where she lives, what she's been up to, who she's close to. I want to know everything." The voice on the other end hesitated. "Sir, she's Eleanor Sutton. Her name carries weight. If we go after her, this could. I don't care who she is." Calloway snapped. "She embarrassed me. In front of a judge. In front of everyone." Silence. "Then, we'll handle it." The call ended. Calloway exhaled sharply, his fingers twitching with rage. No one made a fool of him. No one. The next morning, Eleanor woke up early, slipping into a gray coat before heading out for her usual walk. The crisp autumn air nipped at her skin as she moved through the familiar streets of Crestwood. The town was waking up, shopkeepers unlocking their doors, joggers passing by with headphones in, the faint smell of coffee drifting from the cafe on the corner. It was peaceful, but Eleanor felt something. A shift, a disturbance in the air. She glanced behind her casually. A black sedan was parked across the street. Unfamiliar. Tinted windows. No plates. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. Amateurs. She continued walking, making her way toward the cafe. She could hear the faint hum of an engine behind her, moving at a careful distance. Someone was watching her. She had expected this. But what Calloway didn't realize was, she was watching him, too. Inside the cafe, Eleanor ordered her usual tea and took a seat by the window. Her sharp eyes flicked toward the car parked across the street. Still there. She stirred her tea slowly, thinking. There were two ways this could go. She could ignore it. Pretend not to notice. Let them watch her, gather their information, and wait for Calloway to make his next move. Or, she could end this now. Her fingers tapped lightly against the table. Then, after a few moments, she made her decision. She grabbed her cup, took a slow sip, and then she stood. Eleanor walked straight out of the cafe, across the street, and toward the car. The driver stiffened. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She knocked twice on the driver's window. A beat of silence. Then, the window rolled down an inch. A man in a black suit stared at her. Cold. Unreadable. Eleanor smiled politely. "Good morning," she said. The man didn't respond. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "If you're going to follow someone," she mused, "you might want to be a little less obvious." The man's expression flickered. Just slightly. Eleanor took another sip of her tea, watching him. Then, in a voice so calm it sent a chill through the air, she said, "Tell Calloway I see him." The man's throat bobbed slightly. Eleanor turned, walking away without another word. The window rolled back up. And seconds later, the car pulled away. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around her cup. Calloway had made his move. Now it was her turn. That evening, Eleanor sat in her study, flipping through an old file. It wasn't Daniel's case. It wasn't Calloway's case, either. It was something bigger. Something older. A case from nearly 20 years ago. Her eyes scanned the yellowed papers. A name jumped out at her. Robert Calloway. But not as a victim. Not even as a witness. He was listed under something else. A sealed investigation. Eleanor's breath slowed. She had suspected it before. But now she knew. Calloway wasn't just a liar. He was something worse. And whatever he had done back then, It was something big enough that someone had tried to bury it. Her fingers traced the old court seal on the folder. The system had let Calloway slip through the cracks once. Eleanor Sutton wasn't going to let it happen again. She had him now. And this time, he wasn't going to escape. Eleanor Sutton sat at her desk, staring at the old case file spread out before her. The yellowed pages were filled with forgotten names, faded ink, and legal jargon meant to be buried under the weight of time. But Eleanor knew how to read between the lines. She traced her fingers over a particular section. Robert Calloway, subject of investigation. Case status, sealed by court order. She exhaled slowly. Sealed cases didn't just disappear, not without a reason. Someone had protected Calloway. Someone had ensured that whatever he had done all those years ago never saw the light of day. But Eleanor? She had never been afraid of the dark. A quiet knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced up. Linda Hayes stood in the doorway, looking hesitant. "I didn't mean to disturb you," Linda said softly. "I just wanted to check on you." Eleanor offered a small smile. "Come in." Linda stepped inside, glancing at the papers scattered across the desk. Her brows furrowed. "What is all this?" Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then tapped the old case file. "This," she murmured, "is the reason Robert Calloway thought he could get away with framing your son." Linda's face tensed. "I don't understand." Eleanor leaned back slightly, choosing her words carefully. "This isn't the first time Calloway has lied," she explained. "It isn't the first time he's manipulated the system." She gestured toward the file. 20 years ago, he was the subject of an investigation. Something serious enough that it had to be sealed. Linda's eyes widened. "Wait, you mean he's done something criminal before?" Eleanor's gaze darkened. "I suspect so." Linda swallowed hard, her hands gripping the back of a chair. "But if it was sealed," her voice dropped. "How can you prove it?" Eleanor tapped her fingers against the desk. "That," she said, "is exactly what I intend to find out." Meanwhile, across town, Robert Calloway was losing control. He paced inside his dimly lit office, his mind racing. Eleanor Sutton had backed him into a corner. And now? Now she was digging. Calloway yanked open his desk drawer, shuffling through old folders until he found what he was looking for. An old contact list. A name stood out. Judge Edward Rawlings. A retired judge. One of the few people who had helped bury his past. Calloway snatched his phone, dialing the number. The line rang twice before an old, gravelly voice answered. "Hello, Judge Rawlings," Calloway said, forcing calm into his voice. A pause. Then, "I was wondering when I'd be hearing from you." Calloway's jaw tightened. "I have a problem," he muttered. Another pause. Then, "You mean Eleanor Sutton?" Calloway's fingers twitched. "She's digging," he hissed. "I need to make sure she doesn't find anything." Judge Rawlings sighed. "I told you years ago, we buried that case for a reason. But Sutton," his voice darkened, "she doesn't let things go." Calloway clenched his teeth. "Then we make her let it go." A tense silence stretched between them. Then, the judge spoke again. "There's only one way to make someone like her stop," he murmured. Calloway's blood ran cold. "Are you suggesting?" "I'm telling you," Rawlings said. "If you want to protect yourself, you need to act fast." Calloway's grip on his phone tightened. He knew what the judge was implying. And for the first time, a terrifying thought crossed his mind. Was Eleanor Sutton worth eliminating? Back in Eleanor's study, she carefully placed the old case file into a secure folder. She had learned a long time ago. Cases like this required patience. She wouldn't confront Calloway just yet. No, she would let him squirm. Let him wonder how much she knew. And when the time was right, she would bury him in the truth. But as she reached for her tea, her phone buzzed. She picked it up, glancing at the number. Blocked. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. She answered. Silence. Then, a deep, slow voice. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into, Sutton." Eleanor remained still. Then, in a voice as sharp as steel, she replied. "I always know what I'm getting into." A cold chuckle. Then, the line went dead. Eleanor placed the phone down slowly. She wasn't surprised. She had been expecting the warning. What they didn't know? Eleanor Sutton had never been one to back down. And if Robert Calloway wanted a war, he was about to get one. The warning call had come. Eleanor Sutton had expected it. What she hadn't expected was the calmness that settled over her after. Some people might have been rattled. They might have packed up, disappeared, let fear win. But Eleanor? She was just getting started. She closed the old case file, her fingers tracing the worn edges. Whatever Robert Calloway and Judge Edward Rawlings had buried all those years ago, she was going to unearth it. And this time, no one was going to stop her, not even if they tried. Meanwhile, Robert Calloway was sitting in the back of a luxury car, gripping a glass of whiskey so tightly his knuckles turned white. The city lights blurred outside the tinted windows as his driver weaved through Crestwood's quiet streets. Across from him, a man in a dark suit sat stiffly, watching him with unreadable eyes. "I need this handled," Calloway muttered, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Quietly, the man remained silent. Calloway's jaw clenched. "You're supposed to be the best. So fix this." The man leaned forward slightly. "Eleanor Sutton isn't just some nuisance," he said, his voice low. "She's a legend. You don't just make people like her go away without consequences." Calloway exhaled sharply. "Then what do you suggest?" The man studied him for a long moment. Then, in a calm, deliberate voice, he said, "You break her before she can break you." A slow smile spread across Calloway's face. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the county records office. The building smelled of old paper and dust, the kind of place where secrets sat waiting to be found. She had made a call to an old contact, someone who owed her a favor. A tired-looking clerk led her to a small office in the back. "The files you asked for are in here," he muttered. "But you didn't get them from me." Eleanor gave him a knowing smile. "I was never here." The clerk nodded once before slipping away, leaving her alone with the truth. She opened the first folder, then the second, and by the time she reached the third, her breath slowed. There it was, a list of sealed investigations, and Calloway's name was on it. But it wasn't just him. Her eyes flicked to another name, Judge Edward Rawlings. Eleanor sat back. She had suspected the judge was involved, but this was bigger than she thought. She flipped the page. Then she froze. Her own name was listed, not under an investigation, under a watch list. Her blood ran cold. They had been watching her for years. Before she could process the weight of what she had found, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Check your front door." Eleanor's stomach tightened. She grabbed the files, tucked them into her bag, and left the records office. By the time she reached her home, she knew something was wrong. She approached her front porch cautiously. There was an envelope on the ground. No return address. No markings. She picked it up, peeled it open, and pulled out a single photograph. It was an image of her, taken this morning. Her standing outside the records office. Someone was watching her. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Then, tucked behind the photograph, she found a single slip of paper with a message typed in bold letters. "Stop digging." Eleanor's grip on the paper tightened. They were trying to scare her. They thought a few threats would make her run. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Eleanor stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and locked it. Then, without hesitation, she picked up the phone. "Detective Harris," a gruff voice answered on the other end. Eleanor didn't waste time. "We need to talk," she said. "Now." A pause. Then, "Where?" She glanced at the photograph in her hands, then out the window at the quiet street. Somewhere safe. She had the truth. Now, she just had to survive long enough to use it. Across town, in a dimly lit office, Judge Edward Rawlings leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "She's getting too close," he muttered. Calloway, sitting across from him, clenched his jaw. "I told you she wouldn't back down." Rawlings exhaled sharply. "We should have handled this years ago." Calloway's fingers tapped against the desk. "Then let's handle it now." The judge met his eyes. "You don't just get rid of Eleanor Sutton." Calloway's lips curled into a smirk. "No," he murmured. "But you can ruin her." Silence. Then Rawlings nodded. "I'll make a few calls." The battle wasn't over. It was just getting started. The storm had arrived. Eleanor Sutton sat in a dimly lit diner, a steaming cup of tea in front of her. Across from her sat Detective Harris, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes and a permanent frown. He had been a cop long enough to know when something big was coming. And tonight, it was coming fast. Eleanor slid a folder across the table. Harris opened it. His eyes flicked over the pages. Calloway's sealed investigation, Judge Rawlings's involvement, the names of officials who had buried the truth. After a long silence, he exhaled sharply. "This is bad." Eleanor sipped her tea. "It's worse than bad." Harris closed the folder, rubbing his chin. "This won't be easy." Eleanor leaned forward, her voice low. "Nothing worth doing ever is." The detective looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right, he muttered. Let's burn it all down. That night, the first domino fell. Harris sent the files to an independent journalist, someone who had been sniffing around Crestwood's corruption for years. Within hours, the story broke. Calloway and Judge implicated in sealed investigation cover-up. The news spread like wildfire. By morning, Calloway's name was plastered across every major media outlet. Reporters swarmed his office. Cameras flashed. Questions flew. But the real blow came when the Attorney General's office announced a formal investigation. And just like that, Calloway's empire began to crumble. Eleanor stood outside the courthouse the next day, watching the chaos unfold. A black car screeched to a stop. The door flew open. Robert Calloway stepped out, furious. His once polished image was shattered. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. He stormed toward Eleanor, stopping just inches from her. You think you've won, he seethed. But you have no idea what you've just done. Eleanor looked up at him, calm as ever. I exposed the truth, she said simply. Calloway's fists clenched. You have no idea how deep this goes. Eleanor tilted her head. Oh, she mused. I think I do. Before Calloway could respond, a new black car pulled up. This time, the men who stepped out weren't reporters. They were federal agents. Mr. Calloway, one of them said, pulling out a badge, you need to come with us. Calloway's face drained of color. No, this is a mistake, he protested. This is a setup. The agent didn't flinch. Sir, you're being taken in for questioning regarding multiple cases of fraud, bribery, and obstruction of justice. Calloway whirled toward Eleanor. You did this, he spat. Eleanor met his gaze. I corrected a mistake, she said. Calloway's chest rose and fell rapidly. He wanted to fight. He wanted to run. But there was nowhere left to go. The agents grabbed his arms, leading him toward the car. Calloway struggled, shouting empty threats. But it didn't matter anymore. His power was gone. And the last thing he saw before the car door shut was Eleanor Sutton, standing tall, unshaken, unmoved, and utterly victorious. A week later, Crestwood had changed. The corrupt officials who had covered for Calloway were being investigated. Judge Rawlings had resigned in disgrace. The legal system, which had once enabled the powerful, was now turning against them. And Eleanor? She sat on her porch, sipping tea. Linda Hayes and Daniel sat beside her, watching the sunset. He's really gone, Daniel murmured. Eleanor nodded. For now. Linda frowned. For now. Eleanor smiled slightly. Men like Calloway always come back, she said. There will always be another one. Daniel glanced at her. Then what do we do? Eleanor looked at him. Her gaze was steady. Simple. We fight. Linda squeezed Eleanor's hand, her eyes soft. I hope you know how much you've done for us. Eleanor exhaled, looking at the sky. She had spent years trying to leave this fight behind. But now she knew. It had never been over. And as long as there was injustice, she would never stop fighting. Eleanor Sutton wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Eleanor Sutton had not sought this fight. She had left the courtroom years ago, believing that her time in the legal world was over, that she had done enough, that the next generation would take the mantle. But injustice had a way of calling her back. And when it did, she answered. She had walked into that courtroom as an elderly woman, underestimated and mocked. She had left as a legend reborn. Calloway was finished. His wealth, his power, his arrogance, it had all crumbled under the weight of the truth. The system he had manipulated for years had finally turned on him, swallowing him whole. But Eleanor knew this victory was only a small step in a much larger fight. There would always be another Calloway, another judge willing to look the other way, another young man like Daniel, caught in the crossfire of corruption and greed. And as long as that was true, Eleanor Sutton would not rest. She had spent her life defending those who had no voice, standing against men who thought themselves untouchable. And she would do it again. The sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the sky in warm streaks of gold and crimson. Linda Hayes and Daniel sat beside her, their expressions peaceful for the first time in weeks. They had their lives back, their future, because of her. Eleanor took a slow sip of tea, allowing herself a rare moment of stillness. Justice had prevailed today. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, the fight would begin again. And she would be ready. Because legends never fade. They rise. Again and again. Until justice is done.